Imagine standing in the middle of the Siberian tundra in January. The temperature is minus 52 degrees Celsius. The wind is hitting 70 kilometers per hour, driving the wind chill to minus 78 degrees Celsius. Cold so extreme that your exhaled breath doesn't just fog, it turns instantly into ice crystals that tinkle as they fall to the frozen ground. Cold where exposed skin freezes solid in under 60 seconds. Cold where steel becomes brittle as glass and rubber shatters like ceramic. Cold where the moisture in your eyes starts to freeze if you keep them open too long. Cold that kills. You're not visiting for a day. You're not on some survival challenge that ends when cameras stop rolling. This is your permanent home. The place where you were born, where your children sleep tonight, where your family has lived for thousands of years following the reindeer herds across the frozen tundra. And the only shelter you have, the only thing standing between your family and death by freezing, is a cone of reindeer skin stretched over wooden poles that looks to modern eyes like it couldn't possibly protect anyone from anything serious. No insulated walls. No central heating. No backup generator or emergency services. No way to call for rescue because you're 200 kilometers from the nearest settlement and the temperature outside will kill you before you walk 5 kilometers. You have what your ancestors gave you. Knowledge about reindeer hide, about fire management in confined spaces, about thermal physics that you learned by watching your grandmother, about how to position your body to share heat with your children so they wake up alive in the morning. Here's the part that seems impossible. This shelter, if you know how to build it correctly and use it properly, will keep you warmer and safer than a modern expedition tent costing thousands of dollars with all the latest synthetic materials and technology. It will maintain interior temperatures 50 to 60 degrees warmer than outside using nothing but reindeer skin, a small fire, and engineering principles refined over millennia where families who got it wrong died and families who got it right survived to pass their knowledge forward. The Siberian Nomads, Nenets, Evenki, Chukchi, Sakha, and others, have lived through winters that would kill modern people in hours despite having expensive gear. They've done this for thousands of years. They've raised healthy children, kept elders alive into their 70s, maintained thriving cultures, all while living in portable shelters in one of the most hostile environments humans have ever permanently inhabited. How is this possible? How does a tent made from animal skin work better in minus 50 degrees Celsius than modern technology? The answer reveals engineering so sophisticated that Arctic researchers are still studying it, survival knowledge so accurate it rivals modern physics, and adaptation so complete they represent one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. Before we reveal exactly how Siberian nomads built and lived in reindeer skin tents at minus 50 degrees Celsius and why this ancient design outperforms modern alternatives, drop a comment with where you're watching from. And if stories of extreme survival engineering fascinate you, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to learn will change forever how you think about shelter, cold, and what the human species can actually endure when knowledge becomes the ultimate technology. The Siberian tundra and taiga where these nomadic peoples live presents winter conditions that compound into something almost incomprehensibly hostile to human life. The temperature regularly drops to minus 40 degrees Celsius to minus 50 degrees Celsius and can reach minus 60 degrees Celsius or lower during the worst cold snaps. These aren't brief cold spells. They're sustained conditions lasting weeks or months where the temperature never rises above minus 30 degrees Celsius even at midday. The darkness is oppressive. Above the Arctic Circle, winter brings months of continuous night or twilight where the sun never rises above the horizon. Even south of the Arctic Circle, winter days are brutally short, perhaps 3 to 4 hours of dim light surrounded by 20 hours of darkness. This continuous darkness means no solar heating, no passive warmth, no psychological relief from the crushing weight of cold and night. The wind on the open tundra is relentless. With no trees to break it and no terrain features to deflect it, wind accelerates across the frozen landscape reaching 60 to 90 kilometers per hour during storms. Wind at minus 45 degrees Celsius doesn't just make you uncomfortable. It's a heat-stripping force that pulls warmth from your body so fast that survival time for exposed humans is measured in minutes. The landscape offers almost nothing to work with. The tundra is treeless, no forest to provide lumber, no brush for firewood, nothing but low shrubs and moss. The taiga has trees, but they're often stunted, sparse, and frozen so solid that cutting them is extremely difficult. Fuel for heating is desperately scarce, which means any shelter system has to be extraordinarily efficient because burning large quantities of wood continuously simply isn't possible. Water is frozen solid for 6 to 8 months. Every drop of water used for drinking, cooking, or any other purpose has to be obtained by melting snow or chopping through river ice, both processes that require precious fuel and time in temperatures where spending extended periods outside means frostbite and death. and the nomadic lifestyle makes everything harder. These weren't settled communities living in permanent structures. These were families following reindeer herds across vast distances, moving camp every few days or weeks as the herds moved to access grazing. The shelter had to be completely portable, quick to assemble and disassemble, light enough to transport with the available animals, and robust enough to survive being moved repeatedly through brutal conditions. The tent that Siberian nomads developed to address all these constraints simultaneously is called different names by different peoples. Chum for the Nenets, yaranga for the Chukchi, for some Evenki groups, but the core design principles are remarkably similar because they're all solving the same brutal physics. The construction starts with the frame, and the materials reveal the first adaptation to Siberian scarcity. Where wood was available from the taiga, poles were cut from larch or other cold-hardy trees, each pole perhaps 4 to 6 meters long, straight as possible, processed to remove branches and bark. Where wood was too scarce, poles were made from whatever was available, sometimes even from whale ribs or jawbones in coastal areas, creating frames from the landscape's only structural materials. The frame foundation was a tripod or quadrupod, 3 or 4 main poles lashed together at the top with reindeer sinew or leather thongs. This created an inherently stable structure where 3 or 4 ground contact points prevented tipping even in violent wind. The lashing had to be tight enough to prevent slipping under stress but flexible enough to allow slight movement that let the structure absorb wind energy rather than resisting rigidly until something broke. Additional poles, perhaps 25 to 40 depending on tent size, were leaned against this foundation tripod, creating a conical frame that would support the covering. The poles were positioned at specific angles calculated through generations of experience. Too steep and snow would slide off but wind would attack the structure more aggressively. Too shallow and snow would accumulate dangerously but wind would deflect better. The geometry that evolved was typically 60 to 70 degrees from horizontal, steep enough to shed snow, low enough to deflect wind, optimized for the balance of threats that Siberian winter presented. This wasn't guesswork. This was engineering refined through thousands of winters where inadequate angles meant collapsed structures and dead families. The covering that went over this frame was where the genius of the design really emerged. Reindeer hide has properties that make it nearly ideal for extreme cold shelter, properties that modern synthetic materials struggle to match even with all the advantages of industrial manufacturing. Reindeer hair is hollow. Each individual hair is an air-filled tube. Thousands of these hollow hairs create an insulation layer where trapped air provides exceptional thermal resistance. The hide itself is relatively thin and flexible even when frozen, unlike cattle hide which becomes rigid and brittle in extreme cold. The combination of properties means reindeer skin provides maximum insulation for minimum weight and bulk. The processing of the hides was skilled work that transformed raw material into weatherproof shelter covering. Fresh hides were scraped clean of flesh and fat using bone or metal scrapers. Then they were tanned using methods that varied by culture. Some used the animal's own brain and bone marrow worked into the hide, others used smoke tanning, still others used specific plant materials when available. The goal was creating hide that remained supple at -50 degrees Celsius, that didn't stiffen when it got wet from snow and then dried, and that could survive being folded and unfolded hundreds of times as the tent was assembled and disassembled. A hide that failed any of these requirements would crack, tear, or become unusable within a single winter season. The processed hides were sewn together using sinew thread and bone or metal needles, creating a covering large enough to wrap around the pole frame. A tent housing a family of 6 to 8 people might use 50 to 70 reindeer hides sewn into a single continuous covering. The seams were positioned and stitched so that water couldn't penetrate. The sinew swelled when wet, sealing the stitch holes and preventing moisture infiltration. But here's where Siberian tent design diverged critically from other cold weather shelters and why it worked better than seemingly more sophisticated alternatives. The double wall system that created thermal performance exceeding single-layer designs by enormous margins. A summer tent used a single layer of reindeer hide, adequate for temperatures down to perhaps -10 degrees Celsius or -15 degrees Celsius but insufficient for serious winter. When temperatures dropped toward -40 degrees Celsius, families installed an inner liner that transformed the tent into a fundamentally different shelter. The inner liner was made from lighter, more flexible hides or sometimes from fabric when it became available through trade. This liner hung from a rope or sinew line circling the interior poles at roughly 1.5 to 2 meters height. It descended to the ground, creating a sealed chamber within the tent, with the bottom edge weighted with stones or gear to prevent it from lifting. Between the outer covering and this inner liner, a dead air space formed. This gap, typically 15 to 25 centimeters wide, functioned like the insulating air layer in modern double-pane windows or winter clothing. Air conducts heat very slowly when it can't move through convection, and this trapped air layer prevented heat from the tent's interior from flowing directly to the frozen exterior. The temperature increase from adding this liner was dramatic and quantifiable. Historical accounts and modern reconstructions consistently report interior temperature increases of 15 to 25 degrees Celsius just from installing the liner, before accounting for any fire or body heat. A tent at -45 degrees Celsius exterior might have an interior at -40 degrees Celsius with single-layer construction. Add the liner and the interior jumps to -20 degrees Celsius to -25 degrees Celsius instantly. That's a 20-degree temperature increase from nothing but creating an air gap. This wasn't superstition or tradition. This was accurate understanding of thermal physics applied using only natural materials and empirical observation. But Siberian nomads went further. They understood that the bottom edge where the covering met frozen ground was a critical thermal weak point where cold could infiltrate. Snow was packed around the entire tent perimeter, creating a snow wall 40 to 60 centimeters high that sealed the base and added additional insulation. This snow was positioned carefully, never allowed to contact the hide covering directly because moisture from snow would rot the hide. A small gap was maintained, then the snow wall built up beyond it. The snow blocked wind at ground level where it would otherwise strip heat most effectively, and provided supplemental insulation that raised the effective R value of the tent's base. Some groups added dried grass, moss, or additional small hides between the outer covering and inner liner where materials were available. This stuffing turned the air gap into an insulated cavity, further improving thermal resistance and creating barriers that approached modern wall insulation in effectiveness. The smoke hole at the tent's peak was both essential and problematic. Essential for ventilation and smoke exhaust, problematic because it represented the largest heat loss point in the entire structure. Siberian nomads managed this with adjustable flaps that could be positioned to control opening size based on conditions and fire intensity. In calm conditions with minimal fire, the flaps could nearly close the opening, reducing heat loss to minimum while maintaining enough ventilation to prevent smoke buildup. During storms or when burning a larger fire, the flaps opened wider to exhaust smoke efficiently and prevent dangerous carbon monoxide accumulation inside the sealed space. The flaps were controlled from inside using long poles, allowing adjustment without anyone having to exit into lethal exterior conditions. This interior control was critical because weather could change rapidly in Siberia, and needing to go outside in a sudden storm just to adjust ventilation could mean frostbite or death. The heating and ventilation system inside these reindeer skin tents had to accomplish something that seems thermodynamically impossible: maintain survivable interior temperatures using fuel sources that barely existed in the Siberian landscape while preventing carbon monoxide from killing everyone sleeping in the sealed space. The fire placement was always central, positioned on the tent floor or in a shallow pit at the exact geometric center of the structure. This central positioning wasn't random or traditional preference. It was calculated thermal engineering where heat radiated equally in all directions from the center point, creating the most even temperature distribution possible throughout the interior. A fire position near a wall would create hot zones directly adjacent and cold zones on the opposite side. The temperature differential between the warmest and coldest sleeping positions could be 15 to 20 degrees, making some positions dangerously cold while others were uncomfortably hot. Central positioning eliminated this problem, ensuring everyone experienced similar warmth regardless of where they positioned themselves. The fire itself was modest by modern standards, often just a small pile of burning twigs, dried reindeer dung, or precious pieces of wood no larger than your forearm. Siberian nomads couldn't afford to burn large bonfires because the fuel simply didn't exist in quantities to sustain that consumption through a 6-month winter. The fuel sources reveal the desperate scarcity these families faced. Driftwood collected during summer from riverbanks. Small willow or birch branches gathered wherever scrub vegetation existed. Dried reindeer dung collected from grazing areas and stockpiled for winter. Sometimes even dried moss or lichen when nothing else was available. Every piece of burnable material was precious, and wasting fuel meant freezing before spring arrived. The fire was managed with obsessive attention to efficiency. It was burned primarily in the evening to warm the tent before sleep and to cook the evening meal. During the day, the fire might be reduced to barely glowing coals, conserving fuel while maintaining just enough heat to prevent the interior from dropping to dangerous temperatures. At night, the fire was damped down to a slow burn that would last 6 to 8 hours without requiring fresh fuel. This fuel conservation meant the tent interior was never warm by modern standards. Interior temperatures during occupied periods might reach 5 to 10 degrees Celsius with the fire burning, dropping to -5 degrees Celsius to 0 degrees Celsius overnight as the fire reduced to coals. By modern heated home standards this sounds unbearable, but it's 40 to 50 degrees warmer than the -50 degrees Celsius exterior, and that differential is what made survival possible. The ventilation that prevented carbon monoxide poisoning while retaining heat was engineered with precision that rivals modern HVAC systems. Fresh air entered at ground level through deliberate gaps left under the inner liner's bottom edge. This cold, oxygen-rich air flowed along the floor toward the fire, where it fed combustion and was heated. Hot air and smoke rose naturally toward the smoke hole at the peak and exited the tent. This created a convection cycle that was self-regulating. If the fire burned hotter, it created stronger rising currents that pulled in more fresh air from below. If the fire burned low, convection slowed and air exchange decreased proportionally. The inner liner was critical to making this ventilation work correctly. It created a chimney effect where cold air entered the space between liner and outer covering, flowed upward in this gap away from the living space, and merged with smoke exiting at the peak. Meanwhile, warm air inside the liner stayed in the inhabited zone until it reached the smoke hole. This separation meant fresh air was continuously exchanged without creating drafts across the people inside. Modern tents that vent at ground level create floor-level drafts that make sleeping positions unbearably cold. The Siberian design eliminated this problem through understanding air flow patterns that modern tent designers often miss. But the ventilation had to be monitored continuously. Too much air exchange and heat loss became excessive. Too little and carbon monoxide built up to dangerous levels. Someone in the family, typically an experienced adult, was always partially alert to the air quality, the fire's behavior, and the tent's interior conditions. They would adjust the smoke hole flaps, add or remove fuel, or modify the bottom gaps to maintain the delicate balance between adequate heating and safe ventilation. The sleeping system inside these tents was where survival became most precarious and where Siberian nomads' knowledge became most sophisticated. The tent provided baseline protection. It reduced -50 degrees Celsius exterior to perhaps -5 degrees Celsius interior with minimal fire. But sleeping at -5 degrees Celsius without adequate bedding and clothing would still cause hypothermia within hours. The sleeping area was positioned to maximize every available heat source. It occupied the tent's back section opposite the door, where it was farthest from cold infiltration at the entrance and where radiant heat from the fire reached most effectively. The sleeping area was raised slightly above the floor level using platforms built from available materials, wood planks where possible, packed reindeer hides where wood was too scarce. This elevation mattered enormously because cold air settles at the lowest level. Sleeping even 20 to 30 centimeters above the floor meant sleeping in air 3 to 5 degrees warmer than floor-level air. That temperature difference could be the margin between adequate sleep and dangerous cold stress. The platform surface was covered with thick insulation that prevented ground heat loss. Reindeer hides were layered fur side up, creating a sleeping surface where thousands of hollow hairs trapped air. The hides were positioned to overlap with no gaps where cold could conduct through from below. Total insulation thickness could reach 10 to 15 centimeters of layered reindeer fur. The bedding that covered sleeping people was where the real thermal engineering happened. Large reindeer hides sewn together into robes or blankets were positioned fur side down so sleepers were enclosed in fur on all sides. Multiple layers were standard, 3 or 4 large fur blankets creating total covering thickness of 15 to 20 centimeters. The weight of these coverings was substantial, perhaps 15 to 20 kilograms pressing down on the sleeping family. This weight served a thermal function. It compressed the layers together, eliminating air gaps where convective heat loss could occur while maintaining the insulation value of the hollow hair structure. The compression created a nearly sealed envelope where body heat accumulated rather than dispersing into the tent. The sleeping positions were calculated to maximize shared body heat. Families slept in tight clusters, bodies pressed together continuously. Children were positioned between adults, receiving warmth radiating from multiple bodies simultaneously. Infants slept directly against the mother's body, skin to skin under all the clothing layers, using maternal body heat as a dedicated warming source. Elders whose metabolism generated less heat were positioned in the center of the sleeping cluster rather than at the edges where cold was greatest. The strategic positioning meant those who needed warmth most received it from multiple sources: radiant heat from the dying fire, conductive heat from the platform and bedding, and body heat from adjacent family members. No one undressed for sleep. Every layer worn during the day remained on because that clothing was already warmed by accumulated body heat. Removing it would waste stored warmth and require metabolic energy to rewarm cold fabric. Additional sleeping layers were added over the day clothing, extra reindeer skin garments, additional fur wrappings, creating a clothing system that could add 5 to 7 centimeters of insulation around the entire body. The head was covered completely with multiple wraps of fur, leaving only a small breathing hole around the face. The head represents disproportionate heat loss because blood flow to the brain is constant and the surface area is large relative to the head's thermal mass. Covering it completely was non-negotiable. Hands were drawn inside the clothing layers and pressed against the torso where warmth was greatest. Feet were wrapped in additional furs, creating foot packages that were then inserted into the fur bedding. Extremities freeze first, so they received dedicated protection beyond what the general bedding provided. The sleeping capsule that resulted from this complete system created a microclimate dramatically warmer than the surrounding tent. Inside the layered furs with 5 or 6 people clustered together, temperatures could reach 15 to 20 degrees Celsius even when the tent interior was near 0 degrees Celsius. That 15 to 20 degree differential was what allowed deep sleep rather than the restless, cold-stressed half-sleep that inadequate bedding would produce. But maintaining this through the night required vigilance. One adult remained partially alert, waking periodically to check the fire, to verify that children were adequately covered, to ensure no one had shifted position to expose themselves to dangerous cold. This watch duty rotated among capable adults so no single person became dangerously sleep-deprived. The overnight management also included checking that the smoke hole hadn't become blocked by snow accumulation during storms and that the ventilation system was functioning correctly. A blocked smoke hole with a fire burning could mean carbon monoxide accumulation that would kill the sleeping family before morning. The clothing system that allowed Siberian nomads to function outside in -50 degrees Celsius temperatures was as sophisticated as the shelter and sleeping systems. The outer layer was heavy reindeer fur worn fur side outward so the hollow hairs created wind protection and insulation. This outer garment was a full-body coat reaching to the knees or lower, with sleeves extending past the hands and a hood that covered the entire head. The fur thickness on winter garments could be 3 to 4 centimeters, creating substantial insulation while the wind-shedding properties of the outward-facing fur prevented wind from penetrating to inner layers. Under this outer fur came a middle layer of reindeer skin worn fur side inward, creating a fur sandwich where the body was enclosed in insulating hollow hair on both sides. The innermost layer was softer, thinner reindeer hide or processed fabric, worn directly against the skin to wick moisture and provide a comfortable interface. This layering created multiple dead air spaces between the layers, each adding thermal resistance until total insulation reached 6 to 8 centimeters around the torso. The extremities received the most elaborate protection because they were most vulnerable to frostbite. Hands were covered first with thin fur gloves, then with thick fur mittens, then with outer windproof mittens. 3 layers with air gaps between each layer resulted in hand insulation of 5 to 6 centimeters thickness. Feet got similar treatment. Inner fur boots worn fur side inward. Outer fur boots worn fur side outward. Grass or moss stuffing between the layers adding insulation and absorbing any moisture. Total foot insulation could reach 8 to 10 centimeters, allowing people to stand on frozen ground at -50 degrees Celsius for extended periods. The face, which had to remain partially exposed for vision and breathing, was protected with animal fat rubbed onto exposed skin. This fat created a wind barrier that eliminated wind chill at the skin surface. Even if ambient temperature was -50 degrees Celsius with 60 km/h wind creating -75 degrees Celsius wind chill, the fat layer meant the skin experienced still air at whatever temperature the fat maintained. The actual time spent outside was minimized ruthlessly because even with perfect clothing, prolonged exposure to -50 degrees Celsius was dangerous. Tasks were planned and executed with efficiency born from knowing that wasted time meant frostbite or death. Reindeer were checked and managed quickly. Water was retrieved in the shortest possible trip. Fuel was gathered from stored supplies in minutes. The food system provided the metabolic fuel that made all the other systems work. Human bodies in -50 degrees Celsius conditions burn 4,500 to 5,500 calories per day just for basic survival and minimal activity. This enormous energy demand had to be met with foods preserved from warmer months because nothing grew during the Siberian winter. Reindeer meat was the foundation. Fresh-killed animals froze naturally and could be stored outside in the natural freezer of Siberian winter. Portions were brought inside to thaw slightly before eating, often consumed raw or barely warmed because cooking required precious fuel. Fish caught during summer and autumn were frozen or dried, providing protein and some fats. The fatty fish species were especially valued because fat provides 9 calories per gram compared to 4 for protein, making it the most energy-dense food available. Reindeer fat, milk, and blood all contributed to the diet. The milk was made into cheese and butter that could be stored frozen. The blood was collected during butchering and made into blood sausages or frozen for later use. Every part of the animal was used because waste in these conditions meant potential starvation. The high-fat content of the winter diet wasn't preference, it was survival necessity. Meeting 5,000-calorie daily requirements with lean meat alone would require consuming impossibly large quantities. Fat concentration allowed people to meet energy needs with realistic food volumes. Tea was consumed throughout the day when fuel allowed, providing hydration and psychological comfort. The ritual of preparing and sharing tea maintained social bonds during months of confinement and stress. The children in these families grew up experiencing -50 degrees Celsius winters from infancy, and their survival required even more protection than adults. Infants were carried constantly against the mother's body under all clothing layers, never exposed to cold air except briefly for cleaning. The continuous skin contact and shared body heat kept infants warm despite exterior conditions that would kill them within minutes if exposed. Young children wore more layers relative to their size than adults because their surface area to volume ratio meant they lost heat faster. A 5-year-old might wear 8 layers while an adult wore 5. The children's activity was managed, enough movement to generate metabolic heat, not so much that they sweated and saturated their insulation. The knowledge transmission happened entirely through participation. Children experienced these winters from birth, absorbing every element through observation and gradually increasing responsibility. By the time a young adult was managing their own family's winter survival, they had 15 to 20 years of accumulated experience. They knew by feel what adequate tent warmth felt like versus dangerous cold. They knew by observation how much fuel needed to be gathered. They knew by experience which reindeer hides were suitable for which tent positions. They knew by memory how to read weather signs and prepare for severe cold. This embodied knowledge couldn't be taught through instructions. It had to be lived. The sensory references and experiential judgment that separated adequate execution from excellence could only be gained through years of direct experience. The complete system, shelter engineering, fire management, sleeping arrangements, clothing design, food preparation, worked because every element reinforced every other element. The tent created baseline protection. The fire provided supplemental heating. The sleeping system multiplied body heat effectiveness. The clothing enabled daytime function. The food fueled the metabolic furnace. Remove any element and survival became exponentially harder or impossible. The tent without adequate sleeping systems would mean hypothermia overnight. Perfect sleeping systems in an inadequate shelter would fail. The best shelter and bedding without sufficient food would mean inadequate metabolic heat. That's how Siberian nomads built and lived in reindeer skin tents at -50 degrees Celsius. Through double-wall insulation using hollow hair reindeer hide. Through central heating with obsessive fuel efficiency. Through sleeping capsules that accumulated body heat. Through clothing that created portable thermal zones. Through food that powered the metabolic engines. Through knowledge refined across thousands of years where mistakes meant death and correct understanding meant survival to pass wisdom forward. It worked. It worked reliably enough that cultures thrived for millennia in conditions that kill modern people despite advanced technology. It worked because it was complete, integrated, and executed with precision that came from generations where excellence was the only option survival allowed.